lady down there wants to buy you a beer.
Good lady.
He doesn't get it. I think he does. I knew you'd get it.
What we're going to do in this course is to make sense of those messages that we just saw. Okay, I started off with those clips, with those ads, because that is the subject matter of the course for this semester. Our job is to make sense of that world. And these, I want to stress, you may not have seen these particular ads, but ads like them and carrying messages which are exactly the same surround us almost all the time that we are conscious in a consumer society. They've become literally the air that we breathe. And it's not often that we can, that we're encouraged to kind of step back and take a look at the world that surrounds us, because the world is so familiar. But that's our job this semester. Our job is, in fact, to take is to turn a kind of cold, dispassionate eye onto this world which is so familiar. And in fact, when we look at it, this is actually when we look at it closely, this is a really strange world. This is a world, at least in the stories that are told, that are at the center of the culture, this is a world where normality has taken a holiday, where normal social and physical arrangements simply do not hold, where they are simply held in abeyance. Winter turns into summer. All you need is a remote control and the clouds go away and the sun shines down. A simple shampoo can bring intense sexual pleasure. Spells are cast by love potions and perfumes. When you wear a perfume, and that's how most perfume is sold to us, when you wear perfume and the smell entrances someone else, that is a love potion. You can entrance, you can control other people's emotions, other people's desires can become yours. Goods come alive, like the sunglasses. Goods come alive and leer at women on the beach. And again, sunglasses are not the only goods that come alive. There are many, many commodities, many things that in fact take on human characteristics in ads. Cars take on the physical characteristics of sharks in ocean depths. Again, in this world, cars are not simply transportation devices. Cars actually take on the physical characteristics, the physical manifestations of aspects of nature, whether it is sharks in this case or whether it is horses in another. In beer commercials, and we could spend a long time actually just looking at beer commercials, because beer commercials are a strange world in and of themselves. In beer commercials, there is a parallel universe of fun and sexuality and adventure and excitement, but it is only available to you if you consume, if you order the right beer. If you don't have that commodity, your consumption choice is a passport into this world. Commodities offer instant access to the world of desire, to the world of eroticism, and sometimes, as we will see later in the semester, sometimes even to the world of love. Again, back to beer commercials. Nerdy young men on the beach, through the wonders of video rewind, can constantly call up beautiful women walking by. Actually, remote controls seem to play an interesting role in this world. Actually, in beer commercials, as I said, are interesting in and of themselves. If you think about it, in beer commercials, the men that you see actually are very ordinary looking. And in the ones we saw here, I mean, they were, you know, they were the kind of typical nerdy men sitting on the beach, ordinary men. But the women are all supermodels. And that should tell you whose world this is, who we are looking at, whose eyes we are looking at the world through, when those are the social arrangements that we see. The nerdy young men on the beach, through the wonders of video rewind, can constantly call up beautiful women walking by. An entire and intense experience of a lifetime. This is the ad that featured the elevator, two people looking at each other in an elevator, and in that gaze is encapsulated the entire experience of a lifetime in that gaze. And again, back to beer commercials at the end, old women, old hags actually, as the commercials lay them out, old women become magically young at the behest of young women. At the behest of young men, who only again have to make the right choice in terms of the beer that they order. Now this is, I want to stress, this is on the one hand a very familiar world. Again, if you haven't seen these ads, we are surrounded by other ads that carry exactly the same messages. So it's a familiar world, but it's also, I think, actually a very strange world. Again, once you start to look at it closely, once you start to kind of take it apart, if you were just to describe this world, like it wouldn't be a world that you'd think would exist. And yet, in the representations at the center of our society, and as we'll look today, I think these stories, these images, these ads are everywhere and spreading to more and more places. These ads carry the story of this very, very strange world. And our job this semester is to figure out how to understand this world. And I understand that's it's a tough task, because what I'm asking you to do, in fact, is instead of, because these images actually are images, they're images of pleasure, I mean they're images of familiarity, they're images of fun, they're images of excitement. These images, in fact, attract us. If they didn't attract us, they wouldn't be there. If these images didn't in fact draw us in and didn't in fact want us to desire what it is that they say we should desire, then they wouldn't be there. In one sense, their work is to make this very strange world a familiar world, and I think that they do that, you know, very well. And our job this semester, and it's a difficult job, is to actually take, instead of being in the world, instead of being here, our job, in fact, is to take perhaps a couple of steps back, a couple of analytical steps back, and to look at a familiar world in a new way. That is the task for the semester. If by the end of the semester you're looking at ads in a different way, then the semester has been somewhat of a success. If at the end of the semester you're not looking at ads, you're not looking at the world around you, essentially, not just ads, but you're not looking at the world around you, of which commercial advertising is such an important part. If you're not looking differently, then the semester has been a failure. So you can determine the success of this course actually by the end of the semester. And so our job is to, we have to be, there was a communication theorist who once said, you know, Marshall McLuhan, his name was, he said, you know, we're not too sure who discovered water, but we're pretty sure it wasn't the fish. And what he meant by that was that the fish can't discover the water, because for the fish, the water is the world, and therefore they are blind to it. To discover the water means you have to have someone who comes from outside of that environment. Well, we are in a similar kind of relationship with these images. These images have become literally the water around us. These images have become the air that we breathe, and what we have to do is we have to be able to see the water. We have to be able to see the air. We have to be able to see the stories that surround us, and we have to be able to see them in a new light. And how do we do that? How do we, as I said, this is a world of pleasure, it's a world of fun, it's a world of adventure. How do we, at least for some small moments, how do we stop being part of that world and take that analytical step back to be able to see the world in a slightly different way? What that means is, what we have to do what we have to do is we have to become, instead of becoming consumers of ads, or instead of remaining consumers of ads, we have to become scholars of ads. We have to become people who analyze ads. And in fact, I want you to think of yourselves this semester not as people who live within the consumer society. That's what you do all the time. But I want you to think of yourselves as anthropologists going into a strange world. I want you to think of yourselves as anthropologists who are going into a world that you don't really know, and you're looking at it trying to figure out what it is that makes this world tick. Again, if you talk to anthropologists, it's one of the little jokes within anthropology. I mean, all anthropologists, those people who study other cultures, both contemporary and historically, they always refer to whatever they study as their tribe. Like, what is your tribe? Sometimes those tribes are, in other parts of the world, very, very remote from us. Well, I want you to become anthropologists, and I want you to think about your tribe as us. I want you to think about your tribe as the consumer culture, and try and make sense of it. And if you did, if we were anthropologists from Mars, coming across the Earth, and we wanted to try and make sense of the world, and try and understand what was going on, we would say, wow, this is a culture that seems to be obsessed with material objects. It seems to be obsessed with things. It seems to be obsessed with commodities. They use a lot of commodities, and then messages about commodities are all over the culture. They are obsessed, they would say, with stuff. And they would then say, well, what does that mean to the lives that people live? What does it mean that people are so obsessed with material things? What does it do to the way in which they make sense of their own identity? What does it do to the way in which they make sense of the world? And they would look and they would start to turn that anthropological gaze at this culture. They would start to try and make sense of it in their way. And that is really our task. So the main question that I want to ask for the course is, right, this is just to sum this up as to where we are at the start. The main question I want to ask for the course is, how do we understand and get some analytical distance from subject matter that is so familiar and so much fun? And how do we do it? How do we become anthropologists of a world that is so familiar to us and so much fun? And as I said, it's easier for anthropologists to go somewhere else and do that. It's much harder for us to turn that anthropological eye, to turn that analytical eye inwards into our own culture. Again, I said, if one of those anthropologists from Mars was to come down, one of the things they say about us is that this is a culture obsessed with stuff. This is a culture obsessed with material objects. And they would try and make sense. They would say, well, how do we make sense of this society in which everyone seems to be so connected to goods? What does it do to their sense of identity? What does it do to their way in which they understand the world, in which they organize the world? This is the comedian George Carlin actually making a similar kind of point.
Actually, it's just a little place for my stuff. You got to have that. Got to have a little place to put your stuff during the day, during the evening, whatever it is, don't you? Sure. Everybody's got to have a little place for their stuff. That's all life is about. That's the meaning of life. Trying to find a place to keep your stuff. That's all your house is. Think of it. That's all your house is. It's a place to keep your stuff. If you didn't have so much goddamn stuff, you wouldn't need a house. You could just walk around all the time. That's all your house is. It's a pile of stuff with a cover on it. That's all your house is. It's a place to keep your stuff while you go out and get more stuff. Sometimes you got to move. Sometimes you got to move. You got to get a bigger house. Why? Too much stuff. Now, sometimes you go on vacation. You got to bring some of your stuff with you. Can't take all your stuff. Just the stuff you really like. The stuff that fits you good that month. You got to take a smaller version of your stuff. Say you're going to go to Honolulu for 2 weeks. 2 weeks in Honolulu, you got to take 2 big bags of stuff. You get to Honolulu, you fly halfway across an ocean. You get to Honolulu, get in the hotel room, and you put away your stuff. That's the first thing you do in a hotel room is put away your stuff. I'll put some stuff here, and put some stuff there. You put your stuff over there, I'll put my stuff over here. Here's another place, you put some stuff here. Here's another place over here. Hey, we got more places than we got stuff. We're going to have to buy more stuff. But you put your stuff away, and you know that you're a long way from home, and you don't quite feel 100% at home, but you know that you must be okay because you do have some of your stuff with you. And you begin to relax, you know, feel okay. That's when your friend from Maui calls up, says, hey, why don't you come over to Maui for the weekend, spend a couple of nights over here? Oh, shit. Now what do I bring? Can't bring all this stuff. Right, you've got to bring an even smaller version of your stuff. Just enough stuff for a weekend on Maui. And you go over to Maui and you're really spread out. Now, you've got shit all over the world. You've got stuff in the mainland, stuff in Honolulu, you've got stuff with you. Supply lines are getting longer and harder to maintain. But you get over there to Maui and they give you a little place to sleep, you know. A little windowsill, and you put your stuff, because you don't have much stuff now, on the windowsill. You put your favorite stuff. Your jumbo-sized Visine, your trim nail clippers, your odor eater's 45-day guarantee, and your Afrin 12-hour decongestant nasal spray. And you begin to relax, you know. That's when your friend says, hey, I think tonight we'll go over the other side of the island, visit my friend, maybe stay over. Oh, shit. No! What do you bring? Well, now you just bring the things you know you're going to need. Money, keys, comb, wallet, lighter, hanky, pen, cigarettes, contraceptives, Vaseline, whips, chains, whistles, dildos, and a book. Maybe a little dental floss, depending on who's on the other side of the island.
So that is, that we are defined. I mean, again, I want to make clear, this is not some trivial part of the world. We, in fact, define ourselves through the material world. We define ourselves through the stuff that we collect around us. Now, let me give you an example. For me, and many of you may be at colleges where you've come from other parts of the country, or you may even come from other parts of the world. Well, as you would have come here, as you would have come to a new place, you would have to make that decision that George Carlin talking about. Okay, what stuff do you take with you? What stuff is it that really defines who you are? And so you've already made some of these decisions about, okay, the things that you bring with you that are part of your identity. Now, if we want to understand our relationship to stuff, we had better make sure that we pay attention to the stories about stuff that we're exposed to. Because it's not just that we have material objects that we relate to, is that we, as I said, as we laid out at the start, we live in a world in which there are messages, a consistent stream of messages about what the stuff means, about what goods mean, about what commodities should mean to us. And so if we want to understand our relationship to things, our relationship to stuff, we better understand also the messages that surround us that give us an orientation to that world. And in fact, in North America and in many other Western industrialized countries, and increasingly in other parts of the world, advertising and commercial culture has colonized and invaded public space. And I want to use I'm using those terms very, very specifically. When I talk about colonization, when I talk about invasion, those stories that we looked at already, those stories are spreading into more and more spaces in the culture. And as they're spreading, they're actually nudging out other stories, because there is a limited amount of space, and if you have advertising in that space, it means that other stories are not being told. And so that's why I use the term colonization. That's why I use the term invasion. It is, in fact, to draw attention to that dynamic nature of this message system, the dynamic nature of advertising as it spreads into, as one analyst says, into every nook and cranny of the culture. In fact, many people argue now that our culture has the place where we understand the world the place where stories are told about, you know, what is right and wrong in the world, that our culture has simply become an adjunct to the world of marketing. That has simply been taken over by advertisers and marketers. In fact, a recent study estimated that the average American is exposed to something like over 3,000 commercial impressions every single day. That is 3,000 times during a day that we are appealed to as consumers. Again, I want to draw attention to its dynamic nature. That there is nothing natural about this. There's nothing inevitable about this. That this is in fact part of a process that we as human beings have put together. That we as human beings, in fact, have acquiesced to, and that we're going to allow commercial space, commercial messages, to seep into more and more spaces in our culture. So let me go through this just to give you a sense of how predominant this world is. Let's start off with the media. I mean, it's not only the messages of advertising. We're going to spend this semester looking at the messages of advertising directly. But the messages of advertising come to us through media, through television, through radio, through the internet, you know, through a lot of different forms. And those media carry not only the ads, but they also carry programming. And the programming is, in fact, profoundly influenced by the advertising. Why would I say that? Well, one way you can justify saying something like that is, in fact, simply to look at where the money comes from media systems. So if we look at television, for example, if we look at, you know, ABC or Fox or CBS and say, well, if it's an industry, you know, it sells something. And who does it sell to? Well, the media industry, the television industry, for example, what they sell are audiences. They sell our attention to advertisers. And their money, the money that comes in, almost 100% of the money that comes in to TV stations, to TV networks, comes in from advertisers. And therefore, everything that we see on television, in fact, is geared, you know, it would be a shock if what we saw on television wasn't geared towards its principal customers. And I want to make clear, we're not the principal customers of television. We are the thing that is sold. The principal customers of television are advertisers. In television, about 100% of the money comes in from advertisers. You may say, well, what about in radio? It's about the same. In newspapers, about 80% of the money that comes into newspapers comes in from advertisers. So again, that has a profound impact on what's called the editorial content surrounding it. Even, I mean, if you look at public television, you know, PBS was supposed to be outside of this realm. But in fact, more and more over the last 20 years, more and more corporations have started to have an influence on what appears as programming. So in fact, there is almost nothing that is outside of advertising control when it comes to media. Where radio is the same. If you look at the internet, more and more of the internet is now commercialized. More and more of the internet is now being controlled by the same sources that control television, that control radio, etc. Let's look at the movies. The movies are also simply becoming a vehicle for pushing products at a captive audience. Now, at one time you could say that the movies were outside of the sphere of commercial influence. That in fact, the major thing that Hollywood was concerned with, perhaps, you know, what we can call back in its golden age, but the major thing Hollywood was concerned with, you know, was putting people in seats and in theaters and getting their money through ticket sales. Well, that is still important. But more and more now, as movies are being made, if you can defray the cost of a movie by going to an advertiser and saying, look, we can put your product in the movie itself. We can make your product part of the storyline of the movie itself. Well, that defrays costs. And nowadays in the modern world, in fact, and advertisers actually love this, because what advertisers are always looking for is what they call the captive audience. And in fact, in a movie theater, you are a captive audience. You can't go up and, you know, you can't just get up and go to the fridge and get, you know, a drink. You can't just go up and go to the bathroom very easily. Once you're in that theater, you're stuck in there. And therefore, advertisers love being in the movies. And many movies these days the financing for them is very, very connected to advertisers. It's connected to tie-in campaigns. And the prime function of many Hollywood movies these days is not just to sell your ticket, but to sell you hundreds of other products that are tied into a publicity campaign. Even broader, you used to be able to go into a movie theater and sit there, and then you'd get a few previews, and then the movie would start. Well, nowadays, when you go into one of the cineplexes, you'll get the previews, endless previews, like 15 minutes of these previews of what's coming, the things I want you to come back for. But you'll also now get ads for products. You'll get ads for cars. You'll get ads for Pepsi or Coke or whatever. And again, it is very difficult to get away from them. Once you're in that theater, you are a captive audience. Wasn't always like this. Wasn't always like this. But this is the nature of advertising. And what I want to talk about is, what I want you to think about is the logic that is driving this. What is the logic that is driving this? What is the logic that is driving advertising going into more and more spaces? Because it could go the other way. I mean, perhaps you could, as a society, decide that, in fact, we don't want advertising to go into more and more spaces, that we actually want some places to be free of advertising. That is a decision the culture could make. But it's a decision that we haven't made, and so we have to understand what is the logic that is driving this. Anything that can be sponsored, has been bought up by corporations, from art galleries to museums to symphonies. Let's look at another example, sports. I mean, sports have given up any pretense of independence and simply become marketing devices. Let me give you the most obvious example of that, those of you who are baseball fans, and the appearance in the last 5, 6, 7 years of the ads behind home plate. Okay, when I talk about invasion, when I talk about colonization, that's what I'm talking about. If you were watching a baseball game, 15 years ago, you'd watch a baseball game if you're watching it on television, and when the pitcher was getting ready to throw the ball down to the batter, there wouldn't be a commercial message on the screen. Well, actually, advertisers started to look at that and said, "Well, it's such a waste." And people are looking at the screen. They're really captivated by what's on the thing that's unfolding in front of them. Why can't we be in there? Why can't we be part of that world? And they said, "Actually, look, there's a space behind home plate. Can we get in there? Can we place our ad? Can we place our logo in that space?" And the answer, of course, is yes. And so, again, advertising spreads, colonizes, invades that part of our culture. You can see it in the way in which stadiums are named. Any new stadium that is built, actually even old stadiums, are now, there are naming rights that are sold off. Where the New England Patriots play, it used to be called Foxborough, but it's now called Gillette Stadium. Actually, it used to be called something else. I think it was called CMG Field or something beforehand. But again, when names can be sold like that, well, the names of stadiums can also change depending upon who's willing to spend the money. I believe the Washington Redskins now, the team in the nation's capital plays at a place called FedEx Field. And again, you can duplicate this all around the country. Let me give you an example of advertising. Actually, is when it comes to sports, is actually inside the game. It's not simply that there are these ads here or there, but they have now become part of how we experience sports. For those of you who are football fans, whenever there is an official timeout, okay, when suddenly when either team is not called a timeout, but the networks say we're just going to take a break for an official timeout. Okay, what is that? Well, an official timeout, there's no reason for officials to take time out. An official timeout is a time to play ads. It's a time to say, okay, we're going to now stop the action for about 2 or 3 minutes, and you're now going to watch some ads in the middle of this game. Well, those of you who are football fans, those of you fans of any kind, know how important momentum is. You know that there are rhythms to games, and then when teams get going, they get into a certain rhythm. It's not something you can predict. And what we have here is when teams may get into that rhythm, and what we have here is, in fact, a moment when that rhythm is disrupted. And it's disrupted by advertising. It's disrupted by something from outside saying, okay, let's take a break now, and we'll come back in a few minutes. I mean, that is the way in which advertising is not simply, it's not it's not simply a few trivial messages here or there. Advertising when it comes to sports now is an essential component. It's become part of how we experience the sport. And if you're a sports fan, you have to kind of think about how your experience of sports, how your experience of baseball or football or hockey or whatever else it is that you watch on television especially, how that is influenced, how advertising, the logic of advertising is now an internal part of that experience. We can go to the streets. There are, again, advertising has taken over the spaces of our streets, whether it's Nike in New York or Levi's. And these are, I mean, you can see how big these ads are. They have taken up, I mean, before there was nothing there. There was no commercial message there. Now there is a commercial message there. In New York, the sides of some buildings have become ads. In London, whole buses are now given over to advertising. Again, used to be London buses actually were red. Well, more and more of them now are becoming, again, it's such a waste from a marketing point of view. And if you can place your message there, well, then you become part of the familiar world. There are billboards on, whether it's a bus stop or just billboards on the street. Again, back to London buses, back to street scenes, back to squares, or on the sides of buses. This is from the United States. A bus will play on the side of a bus. On hilltops or in Hollywood. It's not just a Hollywood sign anymore, it's now the Marlboro Man as well, whether it is on taxis. Again, back to just a presence on the street. And we can, if I was to ask you to look at the world in this way, and as I said, if you had a camera by the side of your eyes, and I said every time that you come across an ad, every time you come across a commercial impression when you're being appealed to as a consumer, I just want you to take a picture. You'd be clicking all day long. You'd be clicking all day long, because everywhere we look in the culture, we are being appealed to as consumers. And you'd be clicking all day long. Even, let's turn to education, even those institutions that are normally thought of as public have been colonized by the market and by market forces. Let's look at education. High schools, middle schools have been thoroughly taken over by advertising, whether it is ads in hallways, whether it is curriculum material. Sometimes, I mean, many high schools, the curriculum material that people are using to be taught math or other subjects has been put together by corporations and has incorporated marketing, has incorporated goods as part of that, so that the advertising is now actually in the way in which students learn. Whether it is Channel 1, which is a project that gives schools video equipment, says here is some video equipment, you can have these VCRs and DVDs now for free, and some TV camera and some TV monitors. But what you have to do in return for that is you have to guarantee that you will show this 12-minute clip at the start of every school day. And in this 12-minute clip are 2 minutes of ads. And again, the advertisers love this. The advertisers love a captive audience, because again, once a school signs on to this, they have to guarantee that their students are watching. And there is some fluff new stuff in this 12-minute piece, but the centerpiece of it is advertising. There are ads on the sides of buses. There is a new thing that is called bus radio, whereby students will be, there's going to be radio playing that is sponsored by advertising in school buses as kids are on their way to work. So, you know, as kids wake up, you know, they're listening to music, they're listening to whatever it is, there's ads being directed at them. They get on the bus, and on the side of it there is an ad. They get in the bus, and there is a radio that's playing that is selling them they're selling their listening time to advertisers, and then they're being exposed to commercial messages. They get to school, there's ads in the hallways. They get inside the classrooms, there's ads in the curriculum material. They get outside during the break, and there's Coke and Pepsi machines to look at. They have to watch Channel 1. So education, in fact, has been thoroughly commercialized. We shouldn't say it's just high schools and middle schools. Universities also have been thoroughly infiltrated with these new kinds of messages. Again, every university will have some kind of exclusive contract with a soda, whether it's Coke or Pepsi, to sell their soda on campus. And there is more and more commercial sponsorship on campus itself. Let me give you the kind of one of the best examples of this. What's one of the dangers? A few years ago, Reebok, the shoe company Reebok, actually they're not a shoe company, they make all kinds of other things. Well, they put their logo on lots of other things. Reebok reached an agreement with the University of Wisconsin at Madison. That is, in return for a certain amount of money, the University of Wisconsin will get some money, and Reebok will be allowed to advertise on campus, and also will get to use the logo for the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And when some activists started to look at the contracts on this, it was a very interesting thing. In the contract between Reebok and the university, it said that no employee of the University of Wisconsin at Madison could make any disparaging remarks about Reebok. That was in the contract itself. I mean, again, I have to say, when advertisers go in somewhere, they're not just being, generous. They're not just saying, oh, we should support universities. What they want is control. What they want is control of that environment. Advertisers always want control of the environment. Which meant, if that contract had gone ahead, is that if that contract held, for example, in this class, that in this class we couldn't talk, for example, about how commodities are produced around the world, how Reebok shoes are produced around the world, and the conditions within which they're produced, and how little people get paid who are making them. We couldn't talk about that because that will be seen as disparaging Reebok. And again, when advertisers move in, it's not just the image, it's not just the messages about things that are getting there. When advertisers move into this world, what they want also is control. What they want is to make sure that the world that exists around them is also under their control, that the world that exists around them is compatible with their message. There is another example I'll give you. This is a clip I'm going to show you. One of the films you're going to be watching in the first part features Naomi Klein. One of the readings also features Naomi Klein. And she's the author of a book called No Logo. And you're watching a film called No Logo as well. But this is Naomi talking about, she was invited to Emory University to give a speech, and she recounts actually what happened there. So this is Naomi talking about that.
I recently visited Emory University in Atlanta. Emory has an exclusive deal with Coca-Cola, and I was at Emory to give a lecture on branding of all things, and I was told very apologetically by my hosts that I couldn't have a pitcher of water and a glass of water on stage with me, that I had to have a bottle of Dasani water, which is owned by Coca-Cola. And this is because in their contract with Coke, there's a clause that says that in any public event at the university, they must serve Coca-Cola beverage products. They cannot serve any competing products. And of course, I guess you could understand that you can't be there drinking a Pepsi, but it turns out they consider tap water to also be competing product with their line of bottled water.
As I said, control. Control. Coca-Cola wanted total control, and tap water was considered to be a competitor. Okay, in any of the things that we're going to be talking about, when we talk about, and in this we talk about advertising invading, advertising colonizing, I just want to make sure that we're not just talking about, a few ads getting there. Because people sometimes say, well, what's the big deal? You see a few ads here or there that you wouldn't otherwise see, and people see lots of ads all over the place. It's not just that. I actually think there is a difference when you see more and more things, more and more messages that are the same. I think there actually does matter. Because that means you're not actually listening to then other messages. You don't have access to other values. You don't have access to other stories. Remember, as advertising spreads, they also want control. As I said, whether it's media, whether it's the programming that we see in media, in media, the programming that we see is simply setting up the ads. The real thing that's going on in media is the ads. The programs are just a support to make sure that we're in the right frame of mind to watch the ads for the real customers of television, which is advertisers, whether it is schools, whether it is universities, whether it is sports. Sometimes in universities you can actually see this quite directly in the ways in which some faculty positions are funded. And so there are more and more, there are corporations who are giving endowed chairs. That is, they're saying, here is some money and you can hire someone with this money, but they have to be called something. So there actually is a Taco Bell, I kid you not, there's a Taco Bell professor of business somewhere. There actually is a Kmart professor of marketing somewhere. Again, again, we have to think about the logic. As I'm talking about all these things, remember, these are not just individual cases. I want you to think about how these individual cases actually cohere together into a particular kind of logic. The mayor of New York recently, in fact, announced that its public spaces were now up for bid for sponsorship, so that, in fact, playgrounds in the future will have corporate sponsors. The floor beneath our feet is also fair game. Again, if advertisers don't see, if there's somewhere where there is not advertising, it is in fact totally wasted. It is totally wasted. The floor beneath our feet, this was a campaign that happened in Manhattan a few years ago. It says from the Bamboo Lingerie Company. It says and this was spray painted on the pavement. It says, from here it looks like you could use some new underwear, from the Bamboo Lingerie Company. Or in supermarkets, the last chance to influence you in the cereal aisle. This is cereal ad on the floor itself. Food has been stamped more and more with commercial messages. Last year, in fact, CBS, the TV station, the TV network CBS, had 35 million eggs laser printed with the CBS logo. Actually, and now CBS thinks that you can actually they can market their programs really well by food. A more recent example is this, where ham is being used. This is ham, and on the label itself is an ad for a new TV show that CBS is pushing with Jimmy Smits called Kane. In the contemporary world, everything is sponsored by someone. Actually, in one sense, this is, when we look around this room, there is no obvious corporate sponsorship here, but I think it's going to come soon. I'll be willing to take a bet that within a few years' time, instead of this being, called whatever it is, Thompson 106, I think this will be, this will be Budweiser Hall 102 or something. And in fact, I'm just waiting for that moment. In one sense, you looking at me right now is, from a marketing viewpoint, wasted, and I'm just waiting to be actually approached by advertiser or sponsorship or sponsors saying, would you wear this T-shirt, and we'll give you some research money, we'll give you some books or whatever. In one sense, this is waste of time. You have to look at me. You're a captive audience. Your credits depend upon it, and yet I am not selling you anything to do with commodities. Actually, I've also always wondered, there is hopefully you can't see it, I normally try and keep it out of sight, but there is, I use a computer, and you'll notice that in more and more TV shows, whenever you see a computer being used, you can see the logo of that computer. Well, you can be sure that that computer has been, the reason that computer is there, and the reason you can see that logo is because it has been paid for. Again, anything that is, any place where there is attention is a place where advertisers want to get in. Even outer space. In fact, the latest plans call for the commercialization of space. There are plans, some companies want to, in fact, send out rockets with mile-wide billboards that people will be able to see when it is daytime. So that when you look out into into the sky on a clear day, you would not just see blue sky, you would actually see the logos of whatever company wanted to buy time on these billboards in space. I know it seems outlandish, but you may know. Here is a news story that lays this out. So this actually is looking at outer space, and here is the news story.
Launch a rocket, send it 200 miles into orbit, deploy a Mylar billboard, and inflate it with compressed gas. The Mylar billboard would measure about 2/3 of a mile across and 1/4 mile tall. From Earth, it might appear about half the size of the moon, the company originally said, and envisioned charging $20 to $30 million to whatever corporation might care to buy space.
Pizza Hut has already put its logo on the side of the Russian rocket going into space. There is, as the news story says, there actually is a company that still exists called Space Marketing Incorporated. Pepsi actually is investigating how to use lasers. This is the Pepsi, and again, I'm not making this up, the Pepsi-Cola company is investigating how to use laser technology to project its logo onto the surface of the moon. So that when you look at the moon, what you would see would be not just the moon, you would actually see a logo imprinted on that space. And when we talk about the commercialization of the world, it's not just restricted to this world. Marketers also have their eye on other worlds as well. We can, as I said, you could look at many different examples of this. Public bathrooms, there is more and more. There actually are ad agencies that specialize in getting their ads into bathrooms. Again, talk about a captive audience. You know, when you're there doing whatever you need to be doing, well, you're not going to be doing anything. You're not going to be going anywhere else. That is a perfect time actually to appeal to you. We talked about food and fruit. You know, there are logos put onto fruit, onto bananas. Actually, one of my favorite examples involves boxing. A few years ago, the American boxer Mike Tyson, he's a failed boxer now. He's way over the top. But a few years ago, when he was in jail for rape, and when he got out of jail, he was trying to reconstruct his career. And so they had to set up a number of fights for him where he could essentially, the function of it would be to go there and knock out the person he would be fighting, and he would be, okay, Mike Tyson is back, he looks as sharp as ever. So they were looking for a number of patsies essentially to fight him. And one of these people they found was in England, or actually was in Scotland. And so there was this fight that was going to take place in Scotland, and the prime function of it was that it was to show that Mike Tyson was back, and the guy who was supposed to be fighting would simply be knocked out very quickly. Well, if you're the manager of the boxer who's fighting, and you know that your boxer is going to be knocked off his feet very quickly, because that's the function of the fight, where do you think you would look to place ads? Yeah, where actually an ad was placed on the opponent of Mike Tyson was on the bottom of the soles of his feet. That is, if you're going to be knocked out, that is, and someone's going to be able to see your soles, well, that's a place where attention can be drawn. That's a space that can be sold again to advertising. Again, there is no limit to where advertisers will go. There is no limit to the colonization. There is no limit to the invasion. Bringing it right up to the modern time, contemporary world, YouTube, I always wondered how YouTube was keeping going, and YouTube is, when there's talk about selling it for billions of dollars. Well, how is YouTube going to be funded? Well, it's quite clear now that YouTube is going to be funded by advertising. That's how. Once you've drawn people in through kind of free programming, once you've drawn people in, well, then you can sell their time. And in fact, at the end of 2007, you actually had the first sponsored message that was on YouTube, which was an ad by Neiman Marcus. I said, perhaps in the only free space in the culture right now that you can, the only place where commodities can't go, where advertisers can't go, perhaps maybe churches. I said, this hall will be taken up very quickly. But perhaps churches may be the only spaces that are free of direct commercial influence, but I've got a feeling that will change very soon. And the technology, of course, is shifting as well. The technology of how we can be appealed to. If you've seen the film Minority Report, it's one of Steven Spielberg's films featuring Tom Cruise, you'll remember that in that film, which is set in the future, they talk about, or they show how people will be appealed to very, very directly and personally, even in public spaces. So that as you walk by, because there's something implanted in your eyes, and you know, so there is a device that reads it, and as you're walking through a mall, for example, and then an ad comes up that is directed at you, that actually addresses you by name. And that actually is where we're going. It's not only that advertising is going to be, you know, spreading out more and more, but that advertising actually is going to appeal to us very, very directly. It's already doing that on the internet. Depending upon, you know, which site you subscribe to on the internet, you get a different set of ads than someone else. Depending upon you get a different set of ads. Well, here's the clip from Minority Report that shows how this could work in the future.
A road diverges in the desert. Lexus. The road you're on, John Anderton, is the one less traveled. Make sure you advertise it.
Hello? Good evening, John. You can move the old-fashioned John Anderton. Gourmet cuisine. John Anderton. You could use a Guinness right about now. John Anderton.
Get away, John Anderton. Forget your troubles. It's you.
Actually, that's not so. That's not so far into the future. I mean, and that technology exists already. Again, what's really needed is there something that can identify us as we're walking through public space that could trigger something else. And in fact, there is, and it's a very mundane thing. But to the extent that we have cell phones, and to the extent that cell phones are on, well, that cell phones carry personal information about us. And if those cell phones are on, well, there will be something they'll be able to read that cell phone. And if there is a place where an ad can change, and it could read it very quickly and say, okay, this is an ad for a college student who's 22, who's white, whose income is such and such, whose parents do this, whose credit card debt is this, etc. Here is the perfect ad for them. That we're actually very close to that already. In fact, we're only close to it. It's actually happening. There are billboards on the sides of roads, on the sides of highways, that change between 2 or 3 different ads, you know, when they have that technology that can allow it to switch. Well, one of the ways they switch is there is something that reads what radio stations people are tuned into as they're driving by. And again, the radio station you will be tuned into will tell advertisers and marketers something about yourself. And so if there are a certain number of people who are tuned into this radio station as opposed to this, or this kind of radio station, you know, there are a number of people driving by who have hard rock on as opposed to jazz or something on. Well, the ad can change to reflect that. So that technology is already here right now. So it shouldn't be too mean, given everything that I've talked about so far, and I've spent a little bit of time laying this out. So I want to make clear that this is not just a matter of a few ads here or there. We're really talking about the way in which the culture as a whole has been engulfed by commercial media, and the way it's becoming engulfed more and more. And it shouldn't be very surprising that many commentators now identify the realm of culture, the realm where a society talks to itself, talks about itself, tells stories about itself. Many people now identify the realm of culture as simply an adjunct to the system of production and consumption. And again, I want to make clear, what I'm talking about here is not simply, you know, we're getting ads for Budweiser and for iPhones and for Pepsi or for Coca-Cola, etc. That's not what I think is interesting. Because what I think is interesting is as advertising spreads into all these places, it takes with it a certain set of values. It takes with it a certain set of stories. It takes with it a certain morality about what is right and what is wrong. And that is what is spreading out into more and more of the culture. Now, you know, I've kind of described it in a way that's maybe surprising to some people, and I'm not too sure how surprising that is. But none of this would be surprising, for example, to economists. And economists will look at this and say, well, of course that's how the system has to operate. If you want a system that's based around the selling of things, that's based around the production of things, well, that's what you have to do. You then have to be able to sell those things. And in fact, economists, some of the early economists, for example, Karl Marx, one of the early economists of capitalism in the 19th century, who wrote 3 volumes about this emerging society, he recognized what was the essential feature of the capitalist revolution. And again, just a word about, I'm talking about Marx, and you know, people have their own, their ideas that come with whenever you say Marx. Okay, Marx would have been horrified by the societies erected in his name in Eastern Europe and in China, etc. He would have been horrified at the dungeons that became those societies. The way to think about Marx, the way to think about Karl Marx, is in fact to think about him as an analyst of capitalism. That's what most of his work was about. He wrote very little, in fact, about communism and about socialism and what would come later, but he was an analyst of capitalism. And he was an analyst of capitalism at the start of capitalism. He was an analyst of capitalism in the middle of the 19th century, and what he tried to identify was the logic of this emerging economic system. He tried to get to the core of what the system was going to be about. And in fact, he recognized, and when he was writing his books, he recognized what was the essential feature of the capitalist revolution. In fact, in the very opening lines of Capital, his major thing, he says, this is in your handout, this is quote number 1 from the handout that I asked you to bring today. This is the opening line of Capital, Volume 1. He says, "The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities." As an immense collection of commodities. That's very interesting. He said, what he's doing, he's saying, he's trying to figure out how capitalism, the world that's emerging around him in the mid-19th century, how that world is different to what came before it, to the feudalism that was before it, to the agricultural society before it. And what he draws attention to is this quantitative dimension. He says, what is distinctive about this world is, he says, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. And I'm going to keep coming back to that term, the immense collection of commodities. In fact, he puts it within quotation marks because he's quoting himself from something he wrote before. Because he regards this notion, the idea that capitalism is defined by the number of things that it can produce. That is one of its defining features when you look at it first. When you just look at it, when you want to ask the question, how is this society different to what appeared before? If you just look at the surface, if you just look at what appears before us, then one of the things that will strike us is how many things are produced by this culture. How many things are produced by capitalism. So for him, in initially seeking to distinguish his object of analysis from preceding societies, Marx referred to this quantitative dimension. The difference is quantitative. The number of things that can be produced, the number of commodities that are produced and are available. Indeed, no other society in history, argues Marx, has been able to match the immense productive output of industrial capitalism. And this fact, the fact of its productivity, the fact that it's been able to produce the immense collection of commodities, this affects the way in which the society appears. This is not something that is, this is not something you have to study for a long time. If you're an anthropologist landing in the culture, landing in the society, one of the things you would notice is how much stuff there is produced, how much the focus of attention is around the production and the consumption of things. Objects are everywhere in capitalism. And in that sense, compared to what came before it, capitalism is a truly revolutionary society. And what I mean by revolutionary, it has transformed, dramatically altered the landscape of social life in a very short period of time, in a way that no other form of social organization had been able to achieve. In fact, it is a society that is in constant transformation. It is a society that is in constant transformation. That's our society. We are in constant transformation. That transformation and advertising and the spread of advertising into the culture is part of that transformation, is part of that dynamic movement, is part of that revolutionary, is part of that revolutionary movement in society. In fact, it's so revolutionary. One of the other terms that Marx used actually to describe this revolutionary nature. And in fact, when you read Marx on this, it's unclear whether Marx was, capitalism's greatest critic, as he's often laid out to be, or in fact, capitalism's greatest fan, capitalism's greatest admirer, because he really does admire the way, the dynamic of capitalism that in fact drove away the feudalism and the serfdom that came before it. He really does admire the way in which capitalism was able to destroy that horrible world that existed before. And he and Marx actually saw the capitalist revolution as essential to what would follow later. Because you have to destroy the past before you can in fact construct a new future that's really based on democratic principles of individual liberty and individual freedom, as well as collective responsibility. So and in fact, Marx talks about this as another phrase that Marx and his colleague Engels coined to talk about this transformation, to talk about this revolutionary dynamic. They said, all that is solid melts into air. All that is solid melts into air. That's the nature of its revolutionary transformation. And in fact, we now are starting to realize just how profound that transformation is. The talk, as we're now starting to realize that the way in which we've been producing, the way in which we have been operating, is now changing the climate itself. The global warming is directly connected to our production processes. We're also starting to realize that we are now destroying much of the physical world by using up the resources of the earth to make all this stuff. You can't get more revolutionary than that. You can't get more revolutionary than changing the climate and changing the very nature of the earth itself. That is, as I said, truly revolutionary. Now, of course, so that's this revolutionary dimension. That is this revolutionary nature. But that's not enough. It's not enough only to produce the immense collection of commodities. The immense collection of commodities, once they've been produced, they also have to be sold. Because, if you're a capitalist, if you're involved in the production of things, you've made an investment in goods. You've taken energy, you've taken raw materials, you've taken human labor, and you said, okay, we're going to produce this thing, and you produce whatever it is that you produced. Well, that's not enough. Production is not enough. What you've got to do is, once you've invested all that money in this object, you've now got to transform this object back into money, and into, in fact, more money than you put into it. You have to make sure, in fact, that the thing that is produced is also sold. Because otherwise, there is no further investment in production. If you can't sell what you've produced, there is no reason to have more investment in production. And in fact, from a systemic point of view, if capitalism can't sell what it has produced, it will lapse into stagnation and depression. In fact, it will be over. So once produced, commodities have to go through the circuit of distribution, of exchange, and consumption, so that profit can be returned to the people that invested in the production itself. As I said, if that circuit is not completed, if production doesn't go to consumption, if what is produced is not sold, is not converted back into a money form, the system would collapse into stagnation and depression. Capitalism, therefore, has to ensure that the sale of commodities on pain of death. Let me say that again. Capitalism has to ensure the sale of the immense collection of commodities on pain of death. It's not a matter of, well, if we can't sell, it's a matter of if you can't sell the stuff that's produced, the system will collapse. And so you have to make sure the stuff is sold. So in one sense, the problem of capitalism is in fact not the problem of production. The problem of capitalism, the essential problem of capitalism, in fact, is the problem of consumption. How do you sell the stuff that has been produced? And so central is as I said, this is, okay, once the immense collection of commodities have been produced, they have to be sold. It has to be sold. How do you do that? Well, so central is the consumption, so central is this to its survival that in fact industrial capitalism in the end of the 19th century invents a unique industry to aid it. And that industry is the advertising industry. The aim of the advertising industry would be to ensure that the immense collection of commodities are sold, are converted back into a money form. The function of this new industry will be to recruit the best creative talent of the society and to create a culture in which desire and identity will be fused with commodities. Okay, that is, the function of the ad industry is to create a world, is to get people to think about a world in which goods are central, to think about their own identities, to think about their own desires, to think about themselves in terms of these things that have been produced. If you can do that, if you can in fact, if you can integrate things, if you can integrate commodities into the ways in which people think about themselves, well, then that will be the incentive for them to buy. And if you can get them to buy, well, then the cycle of production and exchange and distribution and consumption can go on and can go on and can go on. So the function of the advertising industry, in fact, it's a very, I mean, what the advertising industry has done is to, I mean, and so central is this. So central is the idea of, so central is the function of consumption, that they have, in fact, recruited the best creative talent of the society. That's where the best creative people are in the society. I wish they were making the great American film or writing the great American novel, etc., but they're not. There's simply not enough money in that. What the most talented creative people in society are doing is trying to figure out how to sell us, you know, cars and beer and pimple cream and pharmaceutical drugs, etc. It really is a strange world. That's just really I mean, you've taken the most creative people in society and you said, get people to buy stuff they don't really need and make it really important to their lives. Make it seem as though they can't live without this stuff. That will be the world you have to create. You have to create a world that is totally focused on things. You have to create a world that is totally focused on commodities. And in fact, Marx, writing about this, actually realized what was needed. He couldn't see the world that would come afterwards. But he talked about, the phrase that he used to describe this, the phrase he used was the fetishism of commodities. That you would have to make a fetish of commodities. The commodities would have to be central to how individuals saw themselves in this culture. And indeed, I would argue, there has never been a propaganda effort to match the effort of advertising in the 20th century and now going into the 21st century. I think it is, in fact, the biggest propaganda effort in history to alter public consciousness. The biggest propaganda effort in history to alter public consciousness. More thought, more effort, more creativity, more time, more attention to detail has gone into the selling of the immense collection of commodities than any other campaign in human history to change public consciousness. That's a big claim, I know. And it's why I want to spend a semester looking at how that has happened. I think the only thing that could come close to advertising in historical terms, in terms of its influence, in terms of how much effort has gone into it, maybe religion over the years. Maybe religion over the years, and maybe the only competitor to advertising. But I want to make the argument that, in fact, advertising is the biggest propaganda effort in history to alter public consciousness. And I've given you an idea of how important it is to our culture. One indication of this is simply the amount of money that is spent on advertising, that is spent on this effort. Today, in the United States, over $250 billion is spent on advertising. $250 billion spent on advertising. That's just advertising. That's not public relations. That's not everything else that goes into media. That is just directly advertising. Globally, the figure is $600 billion that is spent on advertising. This concentration of effort is unprecedented. That's $600 billion a year. The $250 billion a year spent on advertising. $600 billion a year spent on advertising. And these are not just like any other messages. I want to make that clear as well. The messages of advertising, the way when advertising spreads into every nook and cranny, it's not just like every other message that's there. More care, okay, also they're not just like any other message. There is much greater concentration on commercial messages than on the stuff that surrounds it. There more care and resources are poured into the creation of commercial messages. Much greater material and creative resources are expended on ads than on the surrounding programs or the editorial content. Okay, that's why the programming is on television, for example, is so lame and it's so formulaic, etc. It's because, in fact, that's not where the creative effort is. And in fact, about 10 times as much money goes into the ads that appear between the programs that goes into programs themselves. The creative focus on television, in fact, in the culture, is in the commercial messages, not in the editorial content. As I said, that's why programs are so formulaic. That's why programs have to have that's why, for example, comedy shows on television have to have a laugh track. They have to convince us that what we're seeing is funny. Remember, that's what a laugh track is. A laugh track is added after the fact. A laugh track is something that is added, that is taped, is canned laughter, trying to convince us that these shows, which are really lame and formulaic, are funny when they're not funny at all. In fact, if you wanted to compare television commercials to something equivalent, what you'd compare advertising to, in fact, will be the biggest budget movie blockbusters. The biggest budget movie blockbusters. Because second by second, that's how advertising is made. Advertising is made with the care that goes into Star Wars. Advertising is made with the care that goes into Jurassic Park. Advertising is made with the care that goes into these big blockbusters. And there's a lot of fuss in the culture about when these big blockbusters come out. Well, essentially those blockbusters are being produced every single day, and there are thousands of them being produced, and they're being let out into the culture, and what they're carrying with them are these commercial messages. I like to think if Marx were writing today, that he would be struck. That is, if Marx were now writing Capital today, and he said, okay, how is this culture different to what appeared before? That I think actually he would start Capital slightly differently. That he would be struck, that Marx would be struck by the presence not of even more objects, but he would be struck by the presence of messages about the collection of commodities. Not just the collection of commodities, not just the amount of stuff, but the messages about the amount of stuff. So because today, it is messages about the immense collection of commodities that dominates the way the society appears. It is messages about the immense collection of commodities that dominates the way a society appears. In fact, as I said, if Marx were to write, let me give you another example of this in terms of, because sometimes it's tough for people to kind of figure out, to see how prevalent advertising is in the lives that we live. Whenever I drive up to Vermont from Massachusetts, we drive up to Vermont, the moment you cross the Vermont border, you'll notice, in fact, that the only signs by the sides of the road are signs from the state. They actually tell you, there's signs about towns, etc. You no longer have billboards. And that's because the state of Vermont has passed a law that says you can't have billboards by the side of highways. So what you will experience when you go through Vermont is nature. And you'll see nature, in fact, I think, in all its awesome beauty. And it's not polluted by these messages, these advertising messages, these billboards that spring up. In fact, the difference is really noticeable when you drive from Vermont and you then drive down to Massachusetts. And it's almost, well, I wouldn't say it's exactly when you hit the border, but within a few miles of you hitting the Massachusetts border, you'll start to see the billboards appearing on the side of the highway. And again, it's a really stark kind of example that what we see, the world that we construct, is a result of human decisions. Some people decided that the state of Vermont has decided no, they want nature to be unpolluted by commercial messages, and that is not something that has happened in the state of Massachusetts. And so I would like to say, I think if Marx were writing today, he would start capital slightly differently. And in fact, one writer who wrote in the 1960s actually tried to update Marx. And this is quote number 2 on your quote sheet. This is from Guy Debord, who wrote in the 1960s in a little book called The Society of the Spectacle. He says, and said he's mimicking Marx but updating Marx at the same time. He says, quote, "In societies where modern conditions of production prevail, all of life presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that was directly lived has moved away into a representation." And what he means by spectacles is messages. In societies where modern conditions of production prevail, all of life presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. He says all that was directly lived has moved away into a representation. That images have come to dominate the ways in which we think about the world. And I think actually Marx actually would agree with that, and Marx would be very sympathetic to that as a kind of description of where we are with capitalism nowadays. So, to sum up, anyone, and I'm presuming this now includes us, because what we're trying to do is we want to understand this culture. We're going to spend the entire semester understanding this revolutionary culture that capitalism has created. Anyone who wants to understand our culture and our society. In fact, I would argue that this is not just a course in advertising. This is a course in the culture and in the society, and understanding it through the lens of advertising. Because I actually don't think you can understand our culture without looking at the role that advertising has played within it. And anyone interested in trying to understand the world we live in had better come to terms with what I think is this new defining structure and the power of commercial things. Why? Because ads are everywhere, and huge amounts of money are spent creating these ads. Huge amounts of money are spent creating these ads. If we want to understand the world, if we want to be real anthropologists of this world, we had better understand what is happening. And remember, the central argument I want to make is ads are not just frivolous. Ads are not just about whether they convince us to buy beer or not, or whether they convince us to buy cars or not. Okay? It's not just about their persuasive nature, of the persuasive aspect of whether they're effective. Because ads also carry values. Ads also carry stories. Ads also carry a morality. And I'm interested in understanding what is that morality, what are those values that advertising carries as it spreads into every nook and cranny of the culture. As it spreads into every nook and cranny of the culture, as it invades, as it colonizes, as it goes everywhere, what does it take with it? And how does that influence how we think about ourselves, how we think about our families, how we think about our relationships, how we think about our friendships, how do we think about the society, how do we think about the environment, how does it impact all of those things and even more. That is the subject matter for this course. And we'll carry it on next time.